Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, better known as Tarquin the Proud, has easily the worst historical reputation of any Roman king, and perhaps of any Roman period. He was Rome's last king, and his family's actions directly led to the downfall of the Roman kingdom. However, as we discussed in the last episode, his record in the first couple of decades of his rule was actually pretty solid. He managed to integrate the Latins into the Roman state at a level that had not been achieved prior. He defeated the Volsci, the Etruscans, the Latins, and the Sabines, essentially a who's who of early Roman enemies. He started the construction of a temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's leading god, and expanded the Circus Maximus and Colloquia Maxima. However, we are now coming to the decisive moment in Tarquin's reign, and his record as king is about to take a turn for the worse, and directly lead to the downfall and historical condemnation of the Roman monarchy. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask you to subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out, and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. We should quickly note here that many of these events are quite possibly fictitious. By the time of Livy, our primary source on the matter, the Romans had forgotten how exactly the monarchy had fallen, and Livy was left to mostly his own devices to craft the narrative surrounding the overthrow. However, we can't completely discount the account given by Livy, as we have no evidence for or against his narrative. Just keep this in mind as we discuss these events. Anyway, back to Tarquin. The year is 509 BCE. Livy says that the Roman people were not happy with Tarquin and his constant building. Tarquin, seeing this rising tide of unhappiness, decides to fight a war with the Rutuli. The Rutuli, especially their capital city of Ardea, were an extremely rich people, and Tarquin believed that if he could obtain the spoils of war from defeating such a rich people, that he could stem the rising tide of unhappiness. However, Ardea proved to be a fortress, and Tarquin was unable to take the city by storm, and was forced to settle into a siege. At some point during the siege, the king's second son, Sextus, raped a young noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia was married to Lucius Tarquinius Collentanus, Sextus's cousin. After Sextus committed his crime, Lucretia killed herself out of shame and despair. Lucius Collentanus, his father-in-law, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitanus, and two of his companions, Lucius Junius Brutus and Publius Valerius Poplicola, all swore an oath to expel the king and his family from Rome and free the city and its people from the tyrannous king. Lucius Brutus happened to be the tribune of the Salaries. This position was nominally only the commander of the king's personal bodyguard. In practice, however, the tribune was entrusted with the ability to call the Roman Comita, or a gathering of Rome's citizens. At this gathering, the tribune could put forward a motion to revoke the king's imperium. This technically would not remove the king from his office, but it would make him powerless in the eyes of the Roman people, law, and senate, thus depriving him of the ability to conduct royal business. Brutus did exactly this. We are told that he gave a fantastic speech which described, in detail, the crimes that Sextus had committed against Lucretia, along with the abuses of power that Tarquin himself had committed. These abuses of power are not listed out for us, but we can assume that murdering the prior king, along with refusing to appoint new senators, and trying capital punishment cases with no counsel at all, made the list. In the end, it doesn't really matter, as Brutus was successful in convincing the Comita to revoke the king's imperium and to send him into exile. Tullia and Sextus, who were both in the city of Rome, fled in the face of the angry mob caused by the words of Brutus. We are not exactly sure where Tullia went, as she sort of falls off the record around this time, but we do know that Sextus retreated to the city of Gabii, hoping that the garrison there would protect him. However, if you have seen the last episode, you would know that Sextus had essentially taken the city over from the inside. This involved quite a bit of killing and all-around despicable acts. As you can probably imagine, Sextus did not find any allies inside of Gabii, and he was very quickly assassinated upon his arrival to the city. Tarquin, who at this time was still besieging Ardea, quickly received word of the coup that happened back in Rome. He immediately left Ardea. It is unclear if the Roman army there continued to support Tarquin, but it would seem like most did not abandon him, as we are told that Tarquin went to the Etruscan cities seeking support, and that the cities of Veii and Tarquinia sent contingents to join Tarquin's army. This would imply that the army at Ardea, or at least a portion of it, stayed loyal to Tarquin. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collentanus had been elected as the first consuls, with Spurius presiding over the election as the Prefectus Urbi, and were preparing a force to stand against Tarquin. In a surprising and slightly cruel turn, Brutus demanded that Lucius resign his consulship and go into exile. This was due to the simple fact that Lucius carried the name Tarquinius, and supposedly no one could stand to have someone with that name in power. Lucius attempted to resist, but even his own father-in-law joined the chorus of voices calling for his exile, and he was forced to give in, fearing what would happen to his person should he refuse. Lucius's father-in-law, Spurius, was chosen to replace him. Around this same time, Tarquin sent ambassadors to the Roman Senate. Publicly, these men were sent with demands from the king to recover his personal property. In truth, however, these men came to the Senate with the goal of gathering enough support to overturn Brutus's coup and restore Tarquin to the throne. This plot was quickly discovered, and the ambassadors, along with their Roman conspirators, including Brutus's sons Titus and Tiberius, were sentenced to death. Shortly after these events, Brutus left Rome at the head of an army to give battle to Tarquin. Spurius was left in charge of Rome. This battle would come to be known as the Battle of the Silvia Arsia. Silvia Arsia referred to a forested area near where the territory of Rome and the Etruscan city of Veii met. We don't know very much about this battle at all. We know that Brutus led the Roman cavalry, which made sense considering he was the tribune of the Salaries just a few weeks or months prior, while Publius Valerius Popicola commanded the Roman infantry. On Tarquin's side, the king himself commanded the infantry, while his son, Arnus, led the cavalry. The cavalry of both sides were the first to engage. We are told that Arnus and Brutus charged each other and speared each other to death. The infantry quickly caught up and engaged as well. We are told that the right wing of each army was successful. The army from Tarquinia pushed the Republican Romans back, while the Republican Romans pushed the army of Veii back. The battle seemed to be at a complete stalemate, until the army from Veii routed and the Republicans quickly won the day. Publius Valerius Popicola, who was either elected consul shortly before or shortly after the battle, would go back to Rome and celebrate the first triumph for a consul. After this defeat, Tarquin turned to Lars Porsena, an Etruscan king of the city of Cocles. War was quickly declared, and Tarquin and Lars Porsena marched at the head of a large army to Rome. They quickly arrived at the city, and the Senate, fearing that the populace might flee the city en masse, took several measures to ensure the loyalty of Rome's people. These measures included buying a large store of grain from the Volsci and Cumae, exempting the lower classes from taxes and port customs, and nationalizing licenses for the sale of salt. Porsena attacked Rome via the Pons Sublicius, the earliest Roman bridge built over the Tiber by Ansus Marcius, Rome's fourth king. Here, a very famous Roman story would have its beginnings. A man named Publius Horatius Cocles, a descendant of the Horatia gens, the family that had fought for Rome against Alba Longa during the reign of Tullius Hostilius, commanded the Roman army's right flank, along with Spurius Larsius and Titus Herminius. Eventually, the Roman army would be forced back to the other side of the bridge. However, Horatius knew the risk that allowing the army of Tarquin to cross the bridge would pose to Rome itself, and so he ordered his men to destroy the half of the bridge closest to Rome, whilst he held the other side. This shamed his other two commanders, and they forced themselves to join Horatius in holding the other half of the bridge. The three men held firm in the face of enemy missiles and spears, with Horatius even being stabbed in the ass by a spear. Eventually, the other two commanders fell back just before the bridge was fully destroyed. However, Horatius held out until the end, and was forced to dive into the Tiber and swim across the river to get back to Rome. After the siege, Horatius was showered in honors, and given as much land as he himself could plow in one day, along with being given a day of rations by each Roman citizen. Yeah, sounds pretty awesome, right? However, the truth is that this story is likely completely fictional. Even Livy was skeptical of the story, viewing Horatius' swimming as nearly impossible for an armored Roman. The story was likely invented as a way to regain some honor in the face of what was likely a Roman defeat. The Romans probably lost at this battle, and may very well have been forced to destroy their bridge. However, I am with Livy on this one. An armored Roman would have struggled to float in the Tiber, much less swim across it. Another famous story from this period comes in the form of Gaius Mucius Scaevola. The Roman Senate had approved an attempt by Gaius to assassinate Lars Porsena in his own camp. Gaius was able to make his way into the enemy camp undetected. However, the issue was that the day he chose to sneak in happened to be payday for Lars Porsena's soldiers. This meant that the king and his scribe were both present on a raised platform handing out the soldiers' pay. Gaius misidentified the king's scribe as the king and killed the wrong person. Gaius was quickly captured and questioned. When questioned, Gaius told Lars Porsena to his face, quote, "I am Gaius Mucius, a citizen of Rome. I came here as an enemy to kill my enemy, and I am as ready to die as I am to kill. We Romans act bravely, and, when adversary strikes, we suffer bravely." End quote. He also declared that he was the first of 300 Roman youths to volunteer for the task of assassinating Porsena, at the risk of losing their own lives. That was likely a complete lie. Quote, "Watch," he declared, "so that you know how cheap the body is to men who have their eye on great glory." End quote. He then thrust his right hand into a fire which was lit for sacrifice, and held it there without giving any indication of pain. Lars Porsena was so shocked that he sent Gaius back to Rome, and on the same day sent envoys to discuss peace terms. Gaius was an absolute badass. Sadly though, this story is almost certainly fake. Could Gaius have stuck his hand into a fire? Of course. Would it have scared the king so much that he would instantly seek peace? I pretty seriously doubt it. Of course, this was a different time than what we live in now. Gaius sticking his hand into the fire and giving no indication of pain may have been seen as a sign of divine favor, which scared Lars Porsena enough to seek peace. In my opinion, however, I think this is just another story that was told with the hope of regaining some of the honor and prestige that Rome lost to Lars Porsena. This actually brings us to a great moment to talk about the treaty that the two sides would eventually sign. The Romans flat out refused to restore Tarquin to his throne. However, they did give up some of the land that they had won from Veii, along with quite a few hostages. Was this a defeat? Well, sort of. The Romans did lose land, and they lost hostages, but they succeeded in keeping Tarquin off the throne, and succeeded in ensuring that Rome itself retained its independence. So overall, I'd probably call this a draw. Eventually, Tarquin left, or was kicked out, of the court of Lars Porsena, and journeyed to Tusculum, where his son-in-law, Octavius Mamilius, still ruled. Tarquin was able to convince Octavius to support one last attempt to restore him to the throne. This attempt to restore Tarquin would culminate in the Battle of the Lake Regillus. We don't quite know when this battle took place, but Livy tells us it took place in 499 BCE, while Dionysius says 496 BCE. It was probably somewhere between 499 and 489 BCE. Livy says that Tarquin and Octavius were supposed to be joined by a force of Volsci. However, the Roman dictator of the time, Aulus Postumius Albus, rushed into battle before the Volsci could join Tarquin's army. At the battle, Aulus led the Roman infantry, while his master of the horse, Titus Abetius Helvia, led Roman's cavalry. We are not told who exactly led which troops on the other side, but we are told that Tarquin, Octavius, and Tarquin's last son, Titus, all fought in the thick of battle. Tarquin was injured early on while trying to attack Aulus, which would make sense as by this point Tarquin was a fairly old man. Helva, the master of the horse, charged Octavius, and both would be wounded, Helva in the arm and Octavius in the chest. Both were forced to withdraw and lead from a distance. We are told that the remaining Roman exiles in Tarquin's army were able to overpower the Republican army, and one of the consuls for the year, Marcus Valerius Volsus, was slain by Titus, son of Tarquin. It seemed that the day would be lost, and the Republic might be snuffed out. However, just as the fighting seemed its bleakest, Titus Herminius, the man who had stood with Horatius on the Pons Sublicius, managed to slay Octavius, even though it led to his death. This boosted the morale of the Romans, and that morale was even further boosted when Helva ordered his cavalry off their horses and ordered a charge into the flank of the Latins. The Latins, having just lost their king, and now being attacked on their flank, quickly retreated. Tarquin and the remaining few Latins abandoned the field shortly after, and the Romans returned to Rome, where Aulus celebrated a triumph. After this final defeat, Tarquin retreated to the court of Astrothemus at Cumae, where he would die in 495 BCE. His name would forever be hated by the Romans and associated with tyranny and terrible rulers. The men who led the coup would be celebrated as heroes of Rome, while Tarquin would forever be hated. But did he really deserve this hate? Well, yes and no. Tarquin certainly did not do too bad as a king. He fought and beat some of Rome's most famous enemies of the period. He expanded the city and brought enough spoils of war back to build a temple that would stand as a sign of Roman power for centuries to come. Yes, he ignored the Senate. Yes, he killed his predecessor. And yes, he used some underhanded tactics to achieve his goals. But didn't the other Roman kings do similar things? Romulus killed his own brother. Servius was put into power either by a possible coup or by the machinations of the previous queen, not by his own merit or birth. Tullius Hostilius ripped a guy in half using a chariot. Lucius Priscus ensured that his predecessor's sons were away from Rome upon their father's death just so he could secure the throne. I could go on and on, but you get the point. All of Rome's kings, real or not, did bad things. That's just part of the job. It doesn't mean that they should get excuses for those deeds, nor should those deeds be glossed over. But if we are going to acknowledge the shortcomings of Tarquin, then we should also acknowledge the shortcomings of the other Roman kings. Where Tarquin truly messed up was in the raising of his sons. Throughout history, we have seen the downfall of kings and kingdoms not from the actions taken by the king himself, but instead from actions taken by the king's family. This was exactly what ruined Tarquin and the Roman monarchy. If Sextus had been raised to be a respectable Roman, or simply a respectable man in general, he would not have raped Lucretia, and Rome might have continued being a monarchy. In truth, Tarquin receives much of the blame because he was king. This is understandable, as he was the one with the real power. But his son deserves just as much of the blame, as it was his actions that were truly deplorable. Of course, this is all based on history written nearly 500 years later. The true events could have been completely different than what we are told, and all this speculation could be for nothing. But I would love to hear what you think down in the comments. In the end, however, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, better known as Tarquin the Proud, was the last king of Rome, and his name will forever be associated with tyranny and hated rulers. He angered not only the Roman people, but also the Roman aristocracy, so much that it would practically become a cornerstone of the Roman identity to hate everything to do with the monarchy. That hate would even lead in part to the downfall of Julius Caesar, who some consider the greatest Roman of all time, nearly 500 years later. However, Tarquin himself actually ruled fairly decently for the times. He waged successful wars, expanded the city of Rome, and brought plenty of spoils of war back to the city. In the end, however, it was his own son that would cause his downfall, and Rome would never be the same again. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. I hope you will join me next time where we will discuss the Roman regal period as a whole, and I'll give you my final thoughts on the period. If you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, it really helps the channel out. Peace.